Hello, hi everyone, and welcome to Wild Apricot's Expert Webinar Series. We're thrilled to have today's expert webinar presenter, Wes Troclo, a leading expert in database management. Today, Wes is going to talk to us about best practices in how to build and maintain and grow your database so you can actually grow your membership. While we're just waiting for people to log on, I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Lori Smith. I'm the community manager here at Wild Apricot, and on chat sitting next to me is our marketing project manager, Farhad Chiklawala. He'll help you with any technical difficulties you're having, so just chat him in your chat box. And before we jump in, I'd like to go over a few technical details. As participants, you can hear us, but we can't hear you. However, if you notice your control panel, and if you don't see it, just click on that red arrow. You should see that in the right top-hand corner of your screen. You'll have a chat box, and we want you to use that chat box to type in your questions, especially for today, because we've made today purposely a bit more interactive because we know you have a lot of special questions about how to leverage your database. So chat in your questions. We'll read them out loud as we go throughout the presentation. You can also chat us questions via Twitter using this hashtag webinar chat. So Farhad's going to be monitoring that. Send us pictures, share your insights. It just makes learning all the more fun. And if you're having trouble hearing us, which often does happen, try turning up the volume on your computer. We can't really control the volume on our end, so just try everything in your controls. And if you're calling in on your phone, try turning up the volume on your phone. It can make a big difference. And a lot of people ask if we will be recording this webinar, and the answer is yes, and we will be sharing this recording with you in a follow-up email sent out sometime tomorrow. And we'll also put in any other links that we mentioned today, and you can also find it on our website. If you click on the community section, you'll see all past recordings of expert webinars there, as well as upcoming ones that you can sign up to. All right, so now I'm very happy to present our presenter today, Wes Troclo. And we're actually really big fans of Wes here at Wild Apricot because he has this amazing blog, which I encourage you to visit. It's on his website called Effective Database Management. And we actually got Wes to highlight 5 of his best tips or blogs from his site, and that's on our blog right now. And Farhad can share that with you in the chat. But Wes is the president of Effective Database Management, and he's a consultant that's worked with hundreds of associations, nonprofits, and membership organizations for over 25 years. So he's really seen all the scenarios and all the situations and can really talk to how to best use your database. And as we mentioned, he's a blogger and has written 100 articles and blog posts, and this has made him the most published author on data management in the association market. You might know him. He's the author of Put Your Data to Work, 52 Tips and Techniques for Effectively Managing Your Database, and that was published by the American Society of Association Executives. So we can look for that book or share that book later, but basically you are talking to the guru of database marketing and database management. So Wes, I'm very excited to have you here today. I'm just going to make sure you're unmuted here, and welcome. Welcome to Wild Apricot. Great. So I am just going to switch presenter control here and hand that over to you.
Very good.
Okay.
Oh, can you try the other one that I'm logged in under?
Yes, we can. Oh, sorry, wait. Try this one.
Beautiful, thank you.
All right.
All right, so there we go. Well, thank you again, Laura. I'm happy to be here. When I meet with my clients to work on data management issues of any variety, I help associations and membership organizations with system selection and implementation, as well as ongoing data management. And one of the most common questions I get from my clients is, how are we doing compared to other associations? How are we doing compared to other membership organizations in terms of how we manage our data? And so I developed a simple, very simple self-assessment, kind of a Cosmo quiz, if you will. And I'd like to actually start with that. It's a 9-question quiz. It's just, these are simple yes-no questions. And so for those of you listening, If you just grab a sheet of paper, and I'm going to ask you each of these 9 questions, they'll be up on the screen, and you just have to answer yes, sort of, or no to each of these questions. And what this will allow us to do is just give you a sense of where you stand in terms of how you're managing your data today. I promise there'll be no more quizzes beyond this one. But again, just answer yes, sort of, or no to each of these questions. And so the first question is, can you easily tell me who the top 20% of your members and customers are? And that's how you define tops. So who are your best members? Who are your best customers? Can you easily and accurately tell me who that is? Can you pull that list? Just yes, yes, maybe, or no. Number 2, is the majority of your data housed in one database or one source? Or do you have data spread all over your organization? So is the majority in one place, or is it spread out? Is majority yes, no, or maybe? Number 3, can you easily and accurately tell me how many messages you're sending to your members and customers each week or each month or each period of time? Can you look into your system and see, yes, we've sent this many messages to our members over this period of time? Are you easily able to do that? Moving on, number 4, do you have your processes documented? Is there documentation that tells your users, whether they're staff or volunteers, how to process information within your database? Do you have documentation for that? Yes, sort of, or no? Number 5, do you have a process for capturing what I call non-financial interactions? So I'm talking about conversations with your members and customers, maybe by phone, by email, face-to-face. Do you have a process in place for capturing those kind of non-financial interactions? Can your members and customers easily do business with you via your website? In other words, can they go onto your website and join or renew their membership? Can they go onto your website and register for events? Can they go on your website and buy products that you might sell, or perhaps give a donation? Can they do business with you via your website? And the final 3 here. And if they can do business via your website, is the data that they are entering on the website, is that flowing directly into your database, or is that actually coming via, say, an email or some other form that somebody has to rekey into a database? So does the data gathered at your website, does that flow directly into your database? Yes or no? Can you easily and accurately tell me how many volunteers you have? Are you able to query your database and say, yes, here's a list of our volunteers in the past year? And then finally, can you tell me the lifetime value of your members? This requires a little bit of calculation, but not much, and it requires some information data on your members. Can you easily calculate that? And so with those 9 questions, take a look at your sheet, and for every question that you answered, you have to give yourself 2 points. For every question where you answered sort of, give yourself 1 point, and of course 0 points for no. So promise no more math. I'll give you about 20 seconds here to add that all up.
I'm seeing lots of answers in the chat boxes, everyone, so thanks for sharing.
All right, good. So there are 9 questions, so the best score you could have is 18. If you scored more than 18, please check your math. The lowest score is 0. And so if you scored 17 or 18, you're in really, really good shape. There probably isn't much you can learn here. So don't, you're welcome to hang around, but probably don't need to. If you scored between 13 and 16, you're doing very, very well. In fact, by my estimations, you're probably in the top 10% of all associations in terms of how well you're managing your data. If you scored between 7 and 12, I think you're doing pretty good. Probably a lot of opportunities for improvement, but it's not a bad score. And then finally, if you're in that 0 to 6 range, plenty that you can learn today. And so again, the purpose of the self-assessment is just to give you a sense of where you stand right now. And my hope is that by the end of the session today, at least you'll have some ideas on how you can improve on this score. Because everything I talked about there in those first 9 points, if you're able to do those things, all of that is going to contribute to your ability to increase and improve engagement with your members and ultimately actually increase membership. And everything we talk about today is ultimately focused on that. And so speaking of which, I just want to set the stage here as we jump in to the bulk of the session, and that is just to answer a couple of quick questions. The first question, of course, is just what is a database? I'll be using that word obviously a lot. The word is in the name of my company. And a database really, at kind of its most basic level, is just an organized collection of data that can be easily retrieved. And so when we think about databases, we typically immediately think about software, which we'll talk about in a second. But really, any list of information is a database. In fact, I was recalling recently that as a youngster, I used to work, I was a member of 4-H, and I used to work at the 4-H office to help with their monthly mailings. And they actually had metal plates, showed you how old I am, metal plates that were designed to stamp the address onto the envelope that mailed out the newsletter. And those metal plates were just essentially in a shoebox. That is a database, technically speaking. It's just a list of information that's organized for easy retrieval. But the real issue here, of course, is a membership database, and why is having a membership database important? And ultimately, the reason a membership database is important is because not only do you need to have all that information collected in one place, in other words, as an organization, if you need to be able to answer the question, who are my members? But you need to be able to communicate with them and market to them in a way that's relevant. And a good database and a well-managed database will allow you to do that. And so having a membership database, especially as we talk about the software, the technology, having that kind of technology available to you is really critical for the long-term success of your organization. Because again, it's going to allow you to communicate with and market to your members in a way that's relevant to them. Oops. And then finally, how can the database help you achieve your mission or your goals? This is something I would ask you to keep in mind from this point on whenever you think about your data and your database. And that is, whatever decisions you're making, whatever you're working on and thinking about doing in terms of managing your data or using the database, is to think about whatever it is we're about to do, whatever it is we're about to embark upon, how will that help our organization advance its mission? And so you've got to go back and look at what is your mission, and then based on that mission, you determine, okay, will this activity actually advance that? And so a good membership database, of course, will let you do that because, for example, many of my clients might have kind of a philanthropic goal in mind, helping disseminate information about their organization or their profession, or maybe doing fundraising, things like that. Any of those things in terms of your data can be advanced using the data in the database more effectively. And again, as we go through these tips that we're going to discuss for the rest of the session, keep that in mind. How would doing what I'm suggesting you do, how would that help you advance your mission? And then finally, something else to keep in mind, again, as we talk about data management overall, is that data management isn't just about the data and isn't just about the technology. It's really about three things. It's first about the people, and when I say the people, what I'm talking about really is your staff and or your volunteers who are actually managing and using the data. So the first of the, kind of think of a stool with three legs. There are three legs that hold up any good technology project, and that first leg is the people involved. The second leg on that stool are the processes that we use, and we'll talk again more about this as we go through some of the tips. But the processes that are used to manage the data and to manage the database are really, really important. And again, one of the three legs here. The third being the technology itself. So you've got people, process, and technology. Who's managing the technology, how that technology is being managed, and what technology we're using. And when you look at these three legs, where you have the when you have the optimum people, optimum process, and optimum technology, that's where you're going to see your ideal operations or the most optimal performance from your organization. And so again, as we go through this, keep in mind, because again, a lot of my tips will relate more to process actually than to technology, but they are related. Keep in mind that technology alone can't really solve your problems without having the right people in place and without using the right processes to use and implement that technology. None of these three can stand alone. You can have the best people in the world, But if their technology is bad or their processes are bad, they're not going to be terribly successful. You can have the best processes in the world, but if people aren't executing them well, it's not going to matter. And of course, you can have great people and great processes, but your technology is really out of date. You're going to be operating at a really low efficiency. And so having all three of these in place, again, optimized, will give you your ideal operation.
Yeah, and Wes, before you jump into your tips, I just want to point out to everyone that what Wes just said was a really good point, because a lot of people have asked, how can my database help me attract, find, and recruit new members? And a database alone won't attract or find new members for you. You obviously need other strategies and marketing and people and processes in place to do that. But without a proper database to support you, doing that, it's going to be a lot harder. So I just wanted to frame that, because it seems like everyone might think, I didn't want anyone to think technology could solve your problems magically, which I think is what Wes pointed out just now.
Yeah, I think thank you for reiterating that, but that's exactly right. Too often, I think there's a belief that, well, if we just had better technology, things would be better. And often that's the case, but too often that's really not addressing the primary issue. So keeping all of that in mind, what I want to do for the rest of the session is just walk you through 10 tips that I believe, based on my experience with my clients and even my experience as an association executive and a membership director in the past, these are some really quality approaches you can take to managing your data. And keep in mind, again, that the better your data is and the higher quality it is and the more thorough and complete it is, the more effective you can be in terms of communicating with your members, in terms of marketing to your members. And we're not going to get into a lot of detail about how you can do that in terms of actual marketing programs, for example, but suffice it to say that if you've got good information, if you've got complete email addresses, for example, and you have some understanding of the kind of events or products or other things that your members have engaged in the past, then you're going to be able to better market to them and communicate with them. And so let's just jump into the tips. And what I'll do is I'll give the tip, I'll give some examples and some explanation of what I mean here, and then Laura, I'll just ask you if you have any additional questions or you want to add in something as we go. So my first tip is that you need to have data entry guidelines and users guides. These are two distinct things. You need to have these available for whatever database you might be using. So if your organization is using Wild Apricot, or if you're using maybe a homegrown custom system, or if you're using some other off-the-shelf software, you need to have guidelines available for data entry as well as user guides for how to use the system. So the data entry guidelines revolve around the kind of data that essentially you want to require from members and customers when they do business with you, and also relates to how that data should be entered in what format. And so, for example, I've had clients who really all they cared about was getting a person's name and their email address because they could do business that way with them, and that was kind of the bare minimum. If they knew who you were and your email address, that was good enough for them. I've had other clients, other associations and membership organizations who said, we need to know who you are, what your title is, what organization you work with, mailing address, email address, and several other things. And so each organization has to define what those are. But what's critically important is you need to document what those are, especially if you're a volunteer-run organization, because that information gets passed from volunteer to volunteer as volunteers change. And so documenting those data entry guidelines is really critical. The second piece of this is what I call the user's guides. And so the distinction between the data entry guidelines and the user's guides is this. The data entry guidelines say, here's the kind of data we collect and the format in which it should be collected. So for example, street should be ST period, or street should be spelled out. Or when we gather titles, vice president should be spelled out, or VP is acceptable, whatever it is. That's the guidelines for data entry. The user's guides tell us how this data should be processed through the system, again, whatever system we're using. And so if a member joins, what should happen? How does that data get processed through the system? If a member renews, what should happen? How should that information get processed through the system? When it's time to execute membership renewals, again, very important when it comes to volunteer-run organizations, what's the process for executing a renewal process? What do we have to do, if anything, to make that happen? Because again, if you have volunteers changing hands year to year or even more frequently, they're going to need something to refer to say, this is how we do business. And so having these data entry guidelines and these users guides available is going to give you good continuity, especially as we transfer between volunteers. But even among paid staff, one of the critical keys here is that the guidelines make sure that we are processing data in a consistent manner. You probably have all heard the term at one point or another, GIGO, G-I-G-O, which is geek speak for garbage in, garbage out. And the whole concept there is that if we put bad data into the system, or actually more accurately, if we put data into the system inconsistently, then it is very difficult, if not impossible, to pull data out of the system consistently. And so if we're not entering our members correctly in the same process, if we're not all doing it the same way, when it comes time to run renewals, or it comes time to run counts on membership, for example, we may not get accurate data. And so keep that in mind, garbage in, garbage out. Document your processes and make sure you have these documented well enough that they can be passed from staff to staff or volunteer to volunteer.
Sorry, so everyone, if you guys have particular questions on this particular issue or tip, guidelines, or how to enter in the data into your database in a consistent way, throw them in the chat box now. But I do want to just point out while we're waiting for any particular questions to come in, that a lot of you asked, how do you leverage the data in your database? And I think this is what tip number 1 speaks to, and Wes can comment on that. But it's really difficult to leverage any of the data that you have if the data is not put in properly in the first place. So that's why this tip is so important, because if you have volunteers or board members or different people entering the data and it's done inconsistently, then that means you can't pull up what you need when you want to, say, send an email to a group of users or search for stuff. So did I say that right, Wes? Is that why this is so important?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, it simply comes down to consistency. I mean, the classic line that I hear from software vendors a lot is, our software is really smart, but the computers are really dumb. And what they mean by that is the software can do amazing things for you, but it literally does only what you tell it to do, and it can only give you the data that you've given it. And so if you've entered that data inconsistently for whatever reason, then obviously the computer simply cannot spit out what you want it to spit out. And so being consistent is the first key to being successful.
Totally. And so now there's a ton of questions coming in, so thanks everyone. We won't get to everything because we want to get through the entire presentation. We'll take some more at the end, but I think this is a key one from Mike Coffey. What about when members enter in their own data? How do you ensure that that's kept consistent?
That's a great question. So there are a couple of ways that we can do that, and then I'll just add a couple of caveats. One is that, again, depending on your system, the forms that you put on your website that allow your members and customers to enter data, some of those can be controlled to some extent in terms of what can be entered there. And so, for example, if it's an email field, then that field can actually be coded in such a way that if someone enters an email address that is not, in fact, a legitimate email address, meaning it doesn't have an @ symbol or it doesn't have a .domain at the end of it, for example, then the system simply won't accept that. And so there are some ways we can control what data the member or customer puts into their records. But there's a couple of caveats I always throw out to my clients. The first is some things we can't control because there are too many exceptions to the rule. My favorite example is that very often my clients will say to me, well, we want to control for upper and lower case. In other words, sometimes, I don't know why, but sometimes members will go on and they'll put everything in lowercase and they'll put everything in uppercase, so like they're shouting at us. And so my client will say, yep, can't we make the last name field, for example, first letter uppercase and the rest lowercase? And well, the problem with that is that some names actually have uppercase letters in the middle of the name, not at the beginning. And so that becomes a challenge for getting their name correct. And I'm one of those people who believes If you don't get anything else right about your members, make sure you spell their name right. I've got a semi-difficult last name, and it annoys me when they misspell my name. If I'm giving you money or participating in your membership organization, you got to get my name right. So that's the first caveat, is just be careful about what you restrict. And then the second thing is to keep in mind that members, most people these days understand they're managing their own record online. And so if they want to put their whole name in lowercase, I say more power to them. They control that, they can have it. I know some people don't agree with that, but my philosophy is if I'm the member and I want to do silly stuff in my name, let me have it. Let me have at it.
Right. So it really does come down to the nitty-gritty sometimes. And is there just any quick recommendation on what's the best way to document this for different users of the database?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I recommend is when you first start documenting is that you literally just identify the processes that you want to document. So, membership joins, membership renewals are a good example, event registration or event cancellations, refunds, things like that. So decide what you're going to document and then just work through your system step by step and do that process and, write your documentation right next to the, in a Word document next to your screen. Here's what we did next. This is the next step. This is the next step. And be almost as literal as you possibly can. And grab screenshots if you can as well. Especially in volunteer-run organizations, that's really critical because a volunteer is going to take little to no time to actually try to figure something out on their own. And so if the documentation doesn't give them really good step-by-step processes, they're very unlikely to try to figure it out. They'll just give up and then start guessing. So you want to make sure that it's kind of as literal as it can be.
Yeah, and a best practice we have here at Wild Apricot, we document everything because we kind of pretend, what if I get hit by a bus tomorrow and someone has to come in and do this webinar, for instance? What is the exact steps? So we keep it like an internal wiki, which I think is a great tool to document processes and always keep it up to date. So that's a good idea too. Okay, and just one last thing, I just want to share this with the group before you go to your next tip, because Liz Snyder pointed this out and I did share it. She said, it sounds as if we need to clearly identify our strategic goals in order to define what data elements we want to collect. And I just think that's such an important thing to think about before doing any of this. So I want to share that with the group.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Yeah. Next
one. Tip number 2 is simply training. And again, this is incredibly important in all organizations, but it's exceedingly important with volunteer-run organizations. And that is that based on your documentation that we talked about in tip number 1, you need to provide training in those critical areas. If you have paid staff, it's going to be obviously in the areas that they're responsible for. If you have volunteers, it's going to be the areas they're responsible for, but you want to make sure you've got the documentation available to them to help them do whatever it is they have to do. What I've seen with my clients that's successful is, especially again for volunteers, but even for paid staff, is to break this down into very small, manageable chunks. In other words, there's a temptation to say, okay, we need to do these 100 things in the database, so let's do some training and cover all 100 things. And the reality is that most adult learners can't really absorb that much information. So you want to really chunk this down, and so it may be training on membership one day, training on events another day, training on donations yet another day, and that's time consuming. There's no question about it, but the value in doing the training is very, very high if it's done effectively. And I wanted to add here while I'm thinking of it, I have an audio program on my website that's about training, specifically related to training on your database. And normally I sell that, but for anybody who's on the call today, if they want to just email me, I'll be happy to send that over to them. That file was too big to put on the downloads.
Good to know.
Training is absolutely critical, again, whether it's paid staff or volunteers.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, a lot of people here are asking for any kind of templates or anything like that you have on how to create this documentation. So if you have anything, and everyone will look to for some kind of templates or something to send.
Okay, very good.
Good. All right.
All right. So tip number 3 is to eliminate what I call shadow systems. And so let me explain what shadow systems are. For those of you who work in membership organizations or have done volunteer work, in organizations, I suspect, I'd be willing to bet actually, that you've actually encountered these systems, whether you realize it or not. So if you look around your organization and say you have a central database like Wild Apricot to manage your membership and things like that, when you start talking to staff or volunteers about different lists that they keep, what you're going to discover is, almost guaranteed, because I've seen it in every one of my client organizations, you're going to discover that people are keeping lists outside of the database that most likely should be kept in that central system. And so, for example, one of the most common offenders that I see is the list of the board of directors. So again, in most organizations that I've worked with, the board of directors are actually members of the organization. So by definition, they should be, that person's name and contact information should be in your database. Wes is on the board of directors. He's a member of the organization. He's in the membership database. But almost invariably, somebody is keeping that list in addition to the membership database. They're keeping it separately, maybe in an Outlook folder, maybe just in an Excel spreadsheet, because it's one that they commonly communicate with. And so that's what I mean by a shadow system. It's any list of members or customers that most likely can or should exist in your primary system, but for one reason or another exists outside the system. And the reason this is such a big deal is because when you have shadow systems, by definition you have redundant data, which by definition means you have more work to do than you should. In other words, if Wes's email address changes and I've got his email address in 3 different places, I have to update it in 3 different places, and that's inefficient. That's the first problem. But the bigger problem is that it's also less effective in the sense that invariably one of those email addresses will not get updated, and you'll wind up miscommunicating with Wes as a result of that. I've seen this many times, and one of my favorite examples came from a client that I worked with several years ago. I was helping them with a system selection process. They wanted to update their database and actually centralize because they knew they had an issue. But theirs was very extreme in that they had 5 different databases in place, one for their membership, one for their board, one for their email newsletter, one I think for donors, and I can't even remember what the 5th one was. But the likelihood, the more VIP a person was, in other words, for example, a board member, the more VIP a person was, the more likely they were to be in all 5 of those systems. And of course, what they discovered was a board member called them up. She said, I'm changing my address, and would you please update it in your system? They did that. A month later, she called up and said, I've already made this call once. Would you please update it in your system? They did that again, but of course, they're updating it in different systems, and the person taking the call doesn't really realize there are 4 others to update besides their own. The end result is you've got a very angry board member who thinks she's being lied to because she keeps telling them to change her address and she keeps getting stuff at her old address. So shadow systems create those kind of problems. And when you look around your organization, identify those shadow systems and figure out how you can get that data back into your primary database and manage it there.
Yeah, I think you've hit on a key issue here, Wes, that probably affects a lot of small organizations. I know certainly my experience has been that I've had many lists and a lot of duplication. And here's a good point and question from Liz Snyder, which I think is really key. She says she has some older generation executive board members who use shadow systems because that's what they're comfortable with, and they don't want to be using anything too new and techy. So any tips on how to change that culture? And so that hits on this process thing. Like, how do you get someone to actually do things properly?
Right. Well, yeah, it's a classic case of you can lead a horse to water. Well, the reality is, regardless of what you're talking about, whether it's database manager or something else, is if you want to change someone's behavior, you have to determine what's in their rational self-interest to do. In other words, what's the benefit to that person for changing how they're doing something? And so in other words, you can't necessarily sell someone on the idea that if you do it my way, it's better for the organization. Because quite frankly, they may not care. They may not care that it's better for the organization. They only care about what's better for them. I'm not saying everyone's like that, but you may run into that. And so you've got to determine, and that's going to be different for different people, determine what it is that would make them look at this and go, oh, you're right, that actually would be better for me. And so one of the ways I'll do that is and this is, it's true for executives especially. Executives usually understand that if there's value to the organization, that they actually need to look at this and figure out how to do it better. And so the next step in that process then is to say, okay, you've got this list. What are you using it for, and how do you use it? And then how can we make our central system essentially mimic that? And so, for example, one of the most common things I see is the executive director says, look, I need my board list. I need it in Outlook so I can pull up the board list and email it out. And if that's the case, then we have to figure out how we can accommodate that with the data that's in the database itself as opposed to in Outlook. And so, again, for different systems, that's going to be different things. It may be, automatic pulls from the database that updated, or it may be that staff has to update a distribution list. But whatever it is, you have to find a way to accommodate that behavior that also still benefits the primary system.
Right, and typically you can download things as like a CSV file, right? And that's sort of interchangeable with a lot of systems. Is that advisable?
Right.
Yeah.
I think pretty much you'll see any system these days that at the very least you can download CSV files and then upload that in Outlook. And so that's just one example of, obviously there are many like this. But the key is to understand why they have that data, what they're using it for, and then helping them understand how they can use the system to do the same thing.
Yeah, and like Charlotte Pierce here is saying she's experienced that too, and that, just pointing out the benefit is such a good thing to remember. And so one last follow-up question to that, because I think this is also a common situation for a lot of people listening in. So what happens when many people have access to updating the database? Is it better to designate one person? That's from Dominic. Thanks, Dominic.
Right. I am personally not a fan of a single point for data management, because that by design creates bottlenecks, which even for the very, very best, and I've worked with some very, very good data managers, even the very best of them will tell you they just can't keep up with the volume. It's just not possible. They're always behind. Data is coming through them, and so they've got to clean it up, and it'll be days before they get to it. And it's just not feasible these days. So I believe in a kind of a liberal policy of anybody who should have access to the data should have access to the data, and that goes back to our first tip, which is having the documentation, and tip number 2, the training, so that they understand, that user understands how to use the database and how to enter the data correctly. I think overall, all of this is to say you're always going to have problems, and we'll talk about that at the end of the session. But the reality is, it's still, as long as you have the documentation and you're providing the training, in other words, it's not the Wild West, you're just going to be better off kind of sharing the wealth as opposed to creating that bottleneck.
That's a very good point. All right, next tip.
All right. So number 4, if we can move along. Oops, there we go. This is one of my favorites because I worked in associations for about 10 years as Director of Membership in Marketing and Communications. And one of the things I used to always like to say is that, all members are created equal, but some members are more equal than others. And what that means is that we've got to understand that we shouldn't really bend our business rules to accommodate every last thing that happens. And that's what I mean by managing to the exception. So for any given process, let's say, event registration, for all of my clients, and even when I was working in associations, I could always give you some case where something would happen that was different than how the normal registration process would go. And so someone, they want to attend the session, but they don't want to attend this particular event, so they should get a $50 discount or something. And so we'll spend a lot of time to trying to address that problem. And my response is, okay, let's address that problem as it is, a one-off. It's not something that happens frequently, and so we'll deal with it as it comes. But let's not try to program the database. Let's not try to program the website. Let's not try to change our business rules to capture all of that. I mean, we should know how we're going to deal with that, but we don't want to automate all of those exceptions. One of my favorite examples, I was working with an association of lawyers, and it was a very specific type of law that they were practicing. And as it happens, it was kind of, it was in the defense area, and so they didn't want the lawyers from the quote-unquote other side to be able to join the membership organization. It was only for these specific defense lawyers. And so they had set up a very, well, not convoluted, but I felt like a very multi-step process for when you joined. You would fill out all this information online. The system would send that information to their membership manager. She would review all this stuff. It would get approved by a committee, and then they would send out an invoice. And it could be literally up to 60 days before someone asked to join before they could actually get access to everything. And so during the course of the discussion, I asked the membership director, I said, how many new members do you get a year? How many go through this process? And she said, it's about 100. And I said, well, in the last 2 years, how many have actually been rejected because they were the wrong kind of lawyer? And she thought about it a second, and she got a big smile on her face, and she said, it was 2. She only one a year actually get rejected because everyone knows who this association is and who it's for, and so only the people who actually really want to belong will actually apply. And so I suggested, why don't we just let them apply, let them pay online, take them as a member, you review them as soon as they join, but the chances are good they're going to be a good member, and then they're off and running. You don't have to do anything else instead of creating all this other work for us. And so when I say don't manage to the exception, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Don't create a lot of rules or a lot of processes that are designed to catch every little thing that might happen. Focus on what happens most often and then deal with the exceptions.
Great. That's a great point. And Charlotte has called that out, that's a great point for her organization. It's almost like working in fear if you're doing that, isn't it?
Yeah. And again, having been there, I understand, you might have a very vocal board member who doesn't fit the mold. He or she does things differently. And so they are demanding, I should be able to do this, do that, or do this. And the reality is they may very much be an outlier, in which case we just have to communicate to them, everyone else does it this way, so that's what we're going to focus on. If you need help with that particular process, I'll do it for you personally. You just contact me and I'll take care of it.
Yeah, good point. Good point. All right, what's the next one?
All right, so number 5, capture all of your contacts. We started out talking about membership databases, and we have because we're membership organizations, we have a propensity to talk about the membership database. And one of the things I try to encourage my clients to think about is that the database really should be about all of the contacts that you work with in your realm. And so what that means, of course, is most presumably is that you've got both members and non-members that you deal with. Almost with few exceptions, all of my clients in my past 16 years of consulting have always worked with both members and non-members. Non-members can buy things from them. Non-members can register for events. Non-members can buy products. Non-members can donate. So you deal with non-members as well as members. And I'd just like to emphasize that the database really is about, think of it more of a customer and prospective customer database, which will include members, which will include non-members. In a lot of cases for organizations, it may include members, it may include sponsors, it may include exhibitors, which aren't allowed to be members, and so on. So think about your database as managing all of those contacts, and don't think about it so myopically as a membership database only. And one thing I would just want to add in here is that when I'm talking about capturing all your contacts, keep in mind that your members might fit into certain subsets of contacts, for example, board members and things like that, and go beyond that to think about all of your volunteers. One of the things about associations, that every association is reliant on volunteers to some extent, some more than others, especially if it's an all-volunteer organization. And so you need to know who your volunteers are, who's serving on committees, who's speaking at your events, who's writing for your newsletter or magazine, who's contributing volunteer time in some other way, and capture that all in your database. If you recall, one of my questions on my quiz was, can you easily tell me who your volunteers are? And I've found in my experience, again, both as a manager as well as a consultant, that associations are good at managing volunteers for a specific program, but they're not so good at managing volunteers across the entire organization.
Right, and just because I know there's a lot of Wild Apricot users on here, some new people, there is a difference, at least when it comes to membership database, a difference between a member and a plain contact, and you can search and find them differently depending on your needs. So a member contact will have membership levels attached to them, whereas a contact's just a contact in your database. And I think that goes to your other point about you don't want the shadow system. So you put them all in this one database, but then attribute different fields to them so you can pull them up in different ways. And someone asked about member groups, and I think that's a really powerful tool. And I know in Wild Apricot, yeah, you can create those subsets. So if you have some members who are on committees or boards, you can put them into member groups and then email them or contact them separately. And same with volunteers. If they're not members, you can create a free membership level that is called volunteers or something like that, and then just keep everyone in volunteers. So there's different ways of organizing all your contacts, at least in Wild Apricot. If anyone has questions, let us know.
All right. So tip number 6 might be my favorite one. This is what I would call a kind of a higher level activity, and really goes to the point of understanding your membership, and back to the title of our session here of how to use your data to really increase and improve membership. And that is to capture non-financial, non-volunteer interactions in your system. And so what I mean by that is, at the most basic level, is just interactions that you have with members or customers that are noteworthy, and that could be captured in your database, perhaps in a notes area, or even something more advanced than that. But the idea here is that if you've had a conversation with Wes about something significant, then you could put in Wes's record that you had that conversation. And the reason that's valuable, I'll give you an example here in a second of specifically how that can be applied, but just in a general sense, the reason that's valuable is because now you start developing kind of a broader profile of who Wes is. And that's incredibly valuable if you happen to be having a one-on-one conversation with Wes, if you're able to look at his record and see all the other times he talked to us about this or that. But it can also be applied in a broader sense, and I want to give you an example here of what I mean. I worked with an organization called BoardSource. Some of you may be familiar with BoardSource, based in DC, and their focus, their mission is to help nonprofits more effectively manage their boards. So they're focused on board management. And one of the things that BoardSource does, if you're a member of BoardSource, they have what I would call a phone consulting service. And so if you're a member, you call them up and you say, I've got a question about fundraising for my board. How can I make my board more effective at fundraising? And so they'll actually help you on the phone or send you stuff via email, point to stuff on the website. They'll give you all kinds of resources on how to do that. But one of the smart things they do is they capture that request in their database. And so they've got categories of common requests. And if you request that information, obviously they have to look you up to make sure you're a board member. That you're a member of BoardSource. And then they'll give you that information and they'll capture that happened. And one of the neat things they can do, which is what this screenshot shows, is that they can then run a report that shows them over the course of time how many contacts, how many calls they got about these particular issues. And so you can see, if you go over to the total column in the far right, you can see that they got 38 calls over the course of a year on fundraising. And if you go up just one line, they only got 6 calls on ethics. That always kind of gave me a chuckle. Every board member thinks they're ethical, so why would they call? Everyone needs help with fundraising. But the point is, now they've got this data, and they know, well, what are the issues that our members care about? Well, board effectiveness, for some reason, has 0 calls, while fundraising has 38. So maybe we need to change our focus in terms of what kind of products and services we're offering, because now we've got data that tells us what our members are actually asking about. And so I think, again, this has huge value at a higher level as you're getting your data under control. Now you can really start leveraging that data.
Great. And just one question here from Rosanna. Is there sort of like a limit to how many categories you should make, or fields, or different dimensions of your data? Like, she was saying sometimes it gets too cumbersome to manage. So is there any kind of best practice on how many segments or data you should be collecting?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the point is well taken. If you give yourself, I just call them buckets. If you give yourself 40 buckets to collect information in, the reality is you'll have about one piece of data in each of those 40 buckets, and it won't be that useful. And so what you need to do is determine Again, this is going to be different for different organizations, so there's no magical number. But I would say that if you're just starting out, 3 to 5 is probably a good one. You make the buckets really big, and that's better than nothing, so you have to keep that in mind. It's not going to be perfect, but it is going to start providing you with more information. And then as you go along and you start seeing what's happening in these 3 to 5 buckets, you can kind of start broadening that if it makes sense to. I mean, in BoardSource's case here, they actually, this only shows the first page. You notice it's alphabetical, it goes from A to F. They actually had about 25 categories, but they had developed them over several years. And so that it started, I think, at about 8 categories. And that's, I mentioned effectiveness has 0. That may be because it was a new category, or maybe it was too broad a category and they never filed stuff in there. So it's an iterative process as well. Take 3 to 5 to start, do it over time, say 6 months, review that, see what's happening in terms of where that data is falling in those different segments, and then revise as needed. But it's a great question.
Great. And just to further clarify, just very quickly, because I want to get through the other points, could you just give a quick example of what a bucket or a couple buckets might be?
So in this particular case, when we're talking about keeping track of non-financial interactions, a bucket might be it's going to be the category of the discussion. And so again, this is going to vary broadly by association. But let's say, in the case of BoardSource, they're talking about board issues, and so they said the issues are fundraising, or CEO hiring, or CEO evaluation. So each organization needs to look at what's appropriate for them. You might start as broadly as questions about membership versus questions about specific events versus questions about products, for example. But again, it's going to depend very much on the organization.
Great. All right, let's keep going. I know we've got around 10 minutes left, so maybe we'll save some of the questions till the end.
All right, very good. Number 7 is what I call data integrity reports. And in a nutshell, what this is querying the database. I say reports, but it can be queries. Querying the database to find potentially incorrect data. And so my favorite example is if you've got a field in your database that is designated for email address. That's literally what it is. It's the email address field. Now, in Wild Apricot, this probably is already controlled, so it may not apply, but I just want to use this as an illustration. If you have a field like that, an email address must have an @ symbol, and an email address must have a dot something, .com, .edu, .org, in order for it to be a valid email address. We kind of all know this now. But the reality is it's possible in some systems where you could enter bad data in that field. And so you can create a query or report that allows you to look at those fields and say, do I have any data in that field that doesn't look like an email address? And it gives you an opportunity to clean it up. One of my, probably the cleanest database I ever saw was a client I had several years ago. This is actually just a simple access database that they had. But they had developed literally about 50 of these data integrity reports that allowed them to check if there was odd data in there. And so, for example, if you look in the second column here, the fourth one down, it says join date greater than expire date. Now, in their particular system, that was physically possible to happen, meaning that someone could enter the data incorrectly and you could wind up that way. That's logically incorrect. And so therefore they had a query or a report that allowed them to find any records that had an expiration date, or I'm sorry, a join date greater than the expiration date. And they would fix that data. And so that's what these data integrity reports do for you. They allow you the opportunity to find potentially bad data and clean it up. It's like weeding the garden.
Good, all good stuff to know. Keeping that clean, consistent data.
Right. Tip number 8, again, one of my favorites. Any of my clients who've actually implemented this will tell me that it's probably the best thing they've ever done, and that is just to start an internal user group. And what I mean by that is anybody in the organization, or especially if it's power users, should meet on a regular basis to talk about what's going on in the database. And so a regular basis, ideally it's once a week. If you can only do it once a month, that's better than not doing it all. But you get together and you talk about, you have an agenda, what's working, what's not working, how are we going to address that? Because that gives opportunities for staff and volunteers to learn from each other. It gives an opportunity to identify where there are consistent problems within the system, which could be software related or could be process related. And it gives you an opportunity to say, should we keep doing that? One of the things we have to keep in mind is that what we're doing today may not apply next month or next year, and we need to stop doing it. And so these discussions will give you that opportunity. So an internal users group really has tremendous value. Like I said, from my clients, they all love that.
Great, great.
All right, and number 9 is what I call practicing database PR public relations. And what I mean by that is you have to talk about the things that are going well within your database, what's working and what's right. Because too often the focus, especially when it comes to databases and data, too often the focus is on what is wrong. And there's nothing wrong with fixing things that are wrong, but if our entire focus and our entire time is spent focusing on the negative, what happens is eventually people learn to hate the system. And just a very quick story here, I worked with an organization several years ago where there was a woman on staff who constantly complained about everything that was wrong with the database and the data. And the data manager there started sending out monthly updates about all the things they were doing within the database, how they were keeping data clean, how accurate the data was, and so on. And he did this month after month after month. And about 9 months to a year after he started doing that, he was sitting in the lunchroom, and this woman walked in and happened to walk by him, and she stopped and said, "Michael, I just had to tell you, the database, it's wonderful. It's so clean. I just can't believe how great it is." He said he was dumbfounded. He almost choked on his sandwich because he'd never heard her say anything positive about it. But the reality was, not only was the database better than it had been before, but he was telling his staff about that. And when it comes to the database, especially if you have naysayers on staff or naysayers within the volunteer community, you've got to communicate out to them what is working to keep that spin positive.
Absolutely.
So, Lori, it looks like we have a couple minutes here. I have one more point I want to make, but are there any other questions we want to answer at this point?
Sorry, I'm just reading through them now. So I'm just going to scroll up to a few ones that we had earlier. Let's see. Excuse me a second. So here's one from Emma. What's the best way to manage member prospects and your interactions with them? So how would you pull a list with their status and track progress and so forth? So is there kind of like a system or approach to that?
Well, I think, yeah, just in general, what you have to have a system in place that, first of all, flags those records as such. In other words, whether it's Wild Apricot or some other system, when you put Wes's name in the system, are you able to flag it so Wes is in fact called a prospect? Because this goes back to the buckets. The first thing we got to do is put that data in a bucket so that we can query the system to find that information. And this is a really critical point. Goes back to process, the very first thing we talked about, having that documented. So we say when a new potential member enters our system, our ecosystem, enters our world, this is what we do with that information. We put it in the database, and in this field, we mark it as a P for prospect, let's say. And maybe we even go so far as to put a date on that so that we know this is when they entered the system as a prospect. And so then we can query the database for that, and we keep track of that record as a prospect until such time as we determine that they're no longer a viable prospect, which again is a business rule you guys have to establish. But the key is getting them into the bucket, and the most important thing is having a process in place. Define what it is and communicate it out to the users.
Right. So that's where everyone, you really need to think through your strategy overall and then make sure the data is entered right. So Charlotte has a question. How do you engage members to keep their profiles current and engage on the website? Do you have some tools or methods or suggestions for that?
Yeah, the key there, just like we were talking earlier about changing people's behavior, the key is you have to communicate why that is important and valuable to the member. In other words, if you say to me, Wes, update your profile because it's important to us, that doesn't really resonate with me because, frankly, I don't care. What I care about is you saying to me, Wes, update your profile because if we have this, and this piece of information, we'll be sure to only send you email that is relevant to that which you have told me about. And then I go, oh, I see. So what you're telling me is by me giving you this data, you will not send me 10 emails a week. You'll only send me 2, and I'll actually care about those. So you've got to find whatever the incentive is to the member or customer to give you that information. it goes back to that same rational self-interest. Why would I give you my data? And if you can communicate that, then they are much more likely to update their profile.
Okay, and before we wrap up, here's a good question from Amanda that I feel like is the situation for a lot of people. So Amanda gets a lot of business cards at events, and they meet, new contacts in real life situations. So what recommendations do you have, Wes, for creating a system to input that into your database and setting up the fields? And how do you capture all that kind of data?
So there's a couple things there. The first, again, to repeat myself, make sure you have a process identified and documented on how you're going to do that. And one of the things I recommend, especially if you're capturing physical business cards, if you do a lot of that, and some of my clients do run into that issue, is there are several hardware options where you can plug in a card scanner, which will scan the cards and put that information into a spreadsheet. Now, the caveat, of course, is they're not 100% accurate. You will have to review the spreadsheet and probably clean some things up. But that saves a lot of rekeying. And once you get that information into a spreadsheet, many systems, I can't speak to Wild Apricot, but many systems do allow you to then import that spreadsheet into the database. And so now you have them in your database as prospects. And so it's a way of making that data entry much more palatable. It's not, again, not a perfect system, and it does require staff intervention, but it'll save you a lot of time.
Right, and sorry, Amanda, Wild Apricot does not come with a scanner, but that is something you can purchase outside and enter it in. So Wes, you mentioned earlier you had a template or training documents to share. A lot of people have been asking about that, so we'll try to send that to everyone after in a follow-up email. And a few people here have asked, who can we hire to help us train our staff on how to use our database correctly? So we should probably just point them to your email. Right. And actually, a bunch of people are asking for your email right now if you want to throw it in the chat. And I just want to let everyone know I'm actually going to change presenter control back to me, Wes, if that's okay. Right. And I want everyone to know that we are going to be hosting a follow-up webinar to this that will talk a bit more how to apply these strategies in Wild Apricot. And I know a lot of you had questions related to, how does this work in Wild Apricot and so forth. So we're going to create that webinar for you and invite you to that and bring in our support people to show you the nitty-gritty details as well as the overall strategy to grow your membership. So that will be coming up in July. So stay tuned for that. And I just want to let you know that we will be sharing the recording with you tomorrow, along with these templates that we've mentioned. You can also download some of the handouts in your control panel there. That's sort of a new feature that GoToWebinar has. So try just clicking on them and downloading. We have some good stuff in there. And if you're looking for more expert webinars, just visit our community site. We'll have the recording of this webinar posted on that page where you see expert webinars. Just click through there. And you can also join our membership advisory groups and read our members in focus. And in July, we have another webinar on Facebook. So that's with John Hayden, and he's going to show you how you can use Facebook strategically. And finally, just to let you know, we do have a mobile app and mobile-friendly themes now that you can read about, and we integrate with WordPress. All the details are on our website. If you want to learn more about that, we're having a demo on Friday. That's this Friday from 2 to 3 p.m. Or actually, sorry, that's at noon, so wrong time. Mark will be online to help you with that. So, and that's it. And so thank you, Wes, for answering all those questions and for sharing these amazing tips from many years of working with so many associations. It was a pleasure to have you, so thank you. Great. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today and paying close attention, and stay tuned for more announcements. Bye-bye.